Hello there, Lionesses. This is Bobby Carlton. I am the publisher and editor-in-chief of Lioness magazine, as well as the founder of Innovation Women. Today, I am talking with Suffolk University professor Jodi Detjen. And Jodi, Professor Detjen, is the co-founder of Orange Grove Consulting, which is an innovative training and leadership development consultancy. She helps women and organizations eliminate those outdated rules and structures that stifle creativity and innovation. She's the author and co-author of The Orange Line, A Woman's Guide to Integrating Career, Family, and Life. And now she's got a new book. It's called The Next Smart Step: How to Overcome Gender Stereotypes and Build Stronger Organizations. Welcome, Jodi. Let's start off with a little more information about you. How did you get interested in this line of work, and what's your background?
So it's so funny. I always laugh because I tell the story of how I was debating with my aunt about women's rights way back when I was like in middle school in the late 70s. And I just told you everybody how old I am. I've always been interested in this. I've always called myself a feminist with pride. And I've always been interested in women's rights and how do we get more voice? How do we get more power? But, I was a technologist and I was in consulting and I was doing teaching and academia and all these different areas in business. And I never really thought about it. And then I had my second son and my whole world sort of imploded. And I got caught up in this ideal stereotype of motherhood here in the United States is defined, which is you're supposed to be all in and give everything up. And I didn't like it very much. And so I was sort of crashed and burned and figured out a way out back to where I wanted to be. And then as I started doing that, I realized a lot of other women were in the same boat. And so we decided to study it. And so
great.
Our first book really talked to 118 women, professional women, and about how they were, quote unquote, doing it all. And so that's really where it all started.
Nice. So your consulting firm is Orange Grove Consulting. Your first book is The Orange Line. I have to ask, what's the significance of the color orange for you? Or is it just a love of citrus?
Yeah, no, I do like citrus, but it's funny because when we were thinking about orange, the original piece was this idea. We had this thing called the green line. We had a career model, which basically said the green line is when you're all in and you're career myopic. And then there was this red line when you're all in, but you're at home. So you're home myopic. And the orange line was really a blend of the two. And the other thing that was really funny is when we called it the Orange Line, I was actually in California at the time because that's where my co-author is. And I've totally forgot about the Orange Line MBTA here in Boston. So I've gotten nothing but ribbed since then about that. But the beauty of orange is that it's gender neutral. And it's a very powerful color. And there's not a lot of negative connotations associated with it. It's got a lot of vitality and energy associated with it. So that's why we really went with the color orange. And then when we went into the consulting side of it, I actually hired a group of, well, not hired, but I was a class client for a group of entrepreneurial undergrads. And this group of 5 young men came up with the Orange Grove idea. And so we just ran with it. We loved it.
That's great. So a lot of your work has been around stereotypes for women. Can you kind of pull out one of those outdated ideals for women and let's talk about it?
Yeah, it's really funny because I know Lioness is really focused on the female entrepreneur. And so one of my team, Heather Jean McNeil, she does research on female entrepreneurs. And I was asking her this question, and she said one of the things that she sees so much is this concept of I am not the ideal entrepreneur. And in our research, we see that all the time women basically saying, I am not ideal. I am not good enough. And so the whole power of what our work is really about is saying, what are the underlying assumptions that we're making? And look at them and identify them and name them. And then once we name them, I'm not an ideal entrepreneur. Assumption. Now I can reframe it. And we use cognitive behavior therapy research as well as influence research to really say, this is actually very well backed up by research. Once you identify some of these beliefs or assumptions and you see them for what they are, you can change your narrative about them. So if we were to reframe that, I am not the ideal entrepreneur, to actually, there is no ideal entrepreneur. And by me being an entrepreneur the way I want to be an entrepreneur, I'm actually role modeling that there's lots of ways to be an entrepreneur. In fact, why is it that we have this one ideal for entrepreneur anyway? Shouldn't being an entrepreneur be entrepreneurial? So we reframe it. And then once you reframe it, of course, I'm an ideal entrepreneur. There's lots of ways to be an entrepreneur. Now we have 15 million ways to go down that route. Whereas before, it's beating ourselves up. And so underlying these assumptions are these old, outmoded ways of thinking that we've been taught. And so the key is to name it, to give yourself space so you can see it and then reframe it.
Nice. So your first book came out in 2013. I mean, has much changed really since then, besides the pandemic, of course?
Yes, of course. But even then, actually, I think the pandemic is a perfect example of how difficult things are to change. I always say, you know, women have not had rights. I mean, we've been fighting for rights for hundreds of years. So we're not going to expect to have a full-scale change in 40, right? It's not going to happen. It's going to take time. But if you look at what's happening with the pandemic, for example, what you're seeing is that women have taken on the lion's share of the homework. And so, and I don't mean like homework as in school homework, but now it's homeschooling and getting everybody healthy at home and all this stuff, instead of like, why is it the woman's job? And so this stuff still exists in a really big way. And what some of the research suggests is that young women in their 20s don't see it as much, but then the minute they have a kid, all these old norms show up. And there's some research in fatherhood that shows it up. There's some research in motherhood that shows up. But if you look at what women who don't have children in their 20s or have, one of the biggest things is this, I'm not good enough. I have to be really super good and really competitive. And so there's this I am not good enough piece. There's also this example I use a lot. I was reading this author that I follow, and she was talking about, she had a bunch of teenagers over in her basement. This was about 2 years ago. And she yells down, who wants a snack? And they're all like, sure, sure. And so she goes, what do you all want? And the boys are like, hot dogs, pizza. And the girls are like, oh, I don't know. What do you want? And so it's this idea that we're not allowed to name what it is our needs are. We're supposed to put our needs as second. This stuff is still alive and well. And I wish it had changed significantly. And it has gone down. But these assumptions are still very, very prevalent, unfortunately.
Yeah. So your new book is The Next Step: Overcoming Gender Stereotypes and Building a Stronger Organization. Now, you took a slightly different path in terms of creating this book from your first book.
Yeah.
How did it come about?
So what's interesting is that because of our first book, we've been working with a bunch of different people on getting this out, really productizing it, if you will. So we're turning it into, micro learning, and we turn it into workshops, and we turn it into consulting. And so as part of that, we got exposed to a lot of different people. And one of the people we got exposed to was a publisher, Charles Bridge, who's part of Penguin. And so they reached out to us, and they're like, hey, we want to write a book on women and what's going on in the workplace because of all the Me Too stuff. And would you like to write it? And we were like, cool, sure. And so we basically, and they really wanted to take a more organizational perspective. And so what we did was, the first book was really focused on women. And so our second book, we broadened it. We looked at, we did a lot deeper dive in the women's side of it, but we also brought in the men's view. So we interviewed about 25 men, and we looked at their view on some of these stereotypes and how they experience it. So for example, one of the things we found was that, men have the flip side, which is, for example, I've got to earn all the money and take care of the family, and I'm not allowed to do what I want for my life. And so they get as stifled as the women. And these are, for example, very binary definitions of what gender even is, because this is a socialized version of gender, not something that people choose, but something that is socialized. And then the third component of the book is this idea of how has this been embedded in organizations, because organizations really just perpetuate it. And I'm doing some research right now. And what I'm finding is that contrary to what I thought, which was that people bring in these masculinized views of what leadership should be, a lot of times what they're doing is simply enacting what's already there. And because the organization has been developed in this masculine way, for example, be all in at work, they just perpetuate it without questioning, again, these underlying assumptions. And so the book really exposes all this stuff and then talks about a way forward in a very practical way.
A lot of books on gender issues, I hate to say it, aren't really read by the people who need to be reading them. And, it's not my issue. How can we convince the right people to get educated about gender issues and how they affect all of our work?
Yeah, I think it's one of the hardest questions out there, because I think what happens is that nobody wants to sit there and say, oh, I am sexist. Oh, I am racist. I mean, of course, because it's a very negative naming, right? It's negative nomenclature. And so how do you bring people in? And so the way we've tried to bring people in is to say, look, and I think the Me Too movement plus the BLM movement have really helped in this, because they've raised the awareness, not in terms of necessarily what individual people are doing, but in showing how there's this systemic component to it. And so one of the ways that we really try to bring people in is say, look, this is about socialization and about organizational norms. It's not because you chose to be like this. Now, yes, there's a tranche of people who are like that, but most people aren't. And so what we try to say is like, let us help you learn how to do it. And then the other piece is we're working with a lot of organizations around this whole idea of inclusion, and organizations are changing where they're starting to measure what this looks like. They're measuring in terms of hiring and promotion, in terms of performance feedback. And as organizations get better and better at measuring this, what's going to happen is it's going to be a lot easier for you to see, for example, that a manager doesn't have these skill sets. So we need to give them to them. We need to train them. We don't need to sit there and yell at them. We need to say, you don't have the skills. Let's give you the skills. Let's help you get the skills. So I think what's happening is there's a lot of external pressure that is forcing people to wake up and really want to think about and do something about it.
Yeah. So you're also a college professor at Suffolk University in Boston. Are you seeing shifts in thinking from the younger people that you're dealing with, especially when it comes to these gender stereotypes?
So it's very interesting. What I see a really broad base of this. One thing that I see is that the young women are very ambitious, and they have very clear goals as to what they want to accomplish. And actually, there's a lot of research that suggests that this is the case too, that, ambition-wise, young women and young men are pretty neck and neck on this. So the ambition myth is sort of going by the wayside. So that's really good news. The other thing that I am seeing, unfortunately, is that this do-it-all thing, that I must take care of everything, is still alive and well. I'll never forget, like about 3 years ago, I had an all-male student group come up to me, and they were like, Professor Detjen, we didn't do so well as a group because we didn't have a girl on our team. I was like, really? Basically, because what happens is if you have only one female on the team, she tends to do all the work. So I no longer have only one woman on the team. Now I spread it, and I force the team to actually reckon with it. Because once you have two women on a team, now they redistribute the work more fairly. So that piece is still alive and well, and this is problematic because it stops women in all sorts of ways. It hurts women entrepreneurs because they try to do everything instead of start to think about how can I push out this work and delegate. It affects women at home because they're taking care of everything. And so what we really try to say is this is a leadership skill. You got to get good at what you're good at and get rid of the dross.
Nice. So as these younger people are entering the workforce, I mean, is that impacting the corporate dynamics? Are they changing the workplace? Or, God, is the workplace changing them as they enter?
I would say it's mixed. So on the one hand, for example, so many young women now have been through these negotiation trainings. We're actually starting to see a shift in people's expectations that women are going to negotiate versus before, when women negotiated, they often got dinged for negotiation. Mm-hmm. And so now women are just asking. And partly this is generational, right? The younger generation just asks more. And so there's becoming this stronger norm around this. The other thing I think is happening is that I still think that women are doing too much. And so there's still they're still not moving as fast, the velocity of promotion, if you will, as young men. So there's still a problem there, which is partly organizational and partly the women coming to the table and partly the men over speaking and the women under speaking up for themselves. So there's some of that dynamic happening. But the organizations are having to wake up because for example, working with one organization, and they had a senior level talk where it was predominantly male, and the women were all in uproar about it. And so these male leaders heard it pretty darn quickly. And yet this morning I got a talk email, I'm on all these different lists, and it was 3 white men talking. And I'm like, it's 2021. Seriously, you've just sent me an email where you're having a panel. It was a law panel, and it was something generalized about COVID. There's plenty of female experts, really.
Yeah.
So there's still a lot of people just completely obtuse about the whole issue, which is shocking to me. So it's both.
Same here. Do you see big differences in the companies founded by women, or do they suffer from some of these same stereotypes?
So I think what's cool is that when you see, contrary to this women on women myth, what you do see is that women-led companies do a better job of bringing more women up. It doesn't work if there's just a few. So when there's just 1 or 2 women in senior levels, it doesn't work because they're now the representation of all women, and it's much more dangerous for them to bring women up. But when you have enough women to make like a third or more, women will bring women up. And the reason is, and this is what I always tell organizations, it's like, or tell leaders, it's like, let me just tell you something here. You're leaving all that talent on the table. Why the heck are you leaving it all on the table? What a stupid business decision. And the only reason you're doing it is because your norms tell you to do it. And the only reason you can get away with it is because there's so many organizations doing it. The minute you don't have enough organizations doing it, you're not going to be able to compete. And so women leaders, women entrepreneurs, I think are more aware of this because they've experienced themselves and are more open to it. But I will say that I think one of the challenges is that it's easy for women to go the other way and hire too many women. And for example, like my business is predominantly women, my own company, because we do a lot of work around women's issues. And so when businesses ask us for women training, they don't want a man to come in and train. And so we have to work hard to actually overcome the other piece, which is how do we bring more men into the fold and do some of that work. So I think diversity is diversity, right?
I've always been told that diversity is contextual. So you have to look around and say, how can I get more different voices in here?
Exactly. And oftentimes what we're using diversity for is a proxy for different voices. But this works well because these diverse voices, because they come from different backgrounds. If you have a bunch of white women of a certain age, all with the same background, that's not diverse any more than a bunch of white men with a certain background is diverse, because we've all done the same things. We've all grown up in the same way. So you're not getting this different perspective. One of the things I love about teaching at Suffolk is that my teams are from all over the place. I have the Suffolk's got some of the most diverse students. I've got people from pretty much every region of the world coming together. I've got people who are first gen. I have people that have been Bostonians forever. I've got people across the whole spectrum of income. You throw these kids in a team together and it's amazing what they're able to produce because of this diversity. I see it all the time. It's powerful.
So, all right, we've got all these women founders who are listening to us here.
Yeah.
What are some things that they can do as they set up their companies, as they scale their companies, to avoid some of these big issues?
Well, I think the first thing is to listen to that inner voice that's naysaying. So that inner voice that's saying, oh, I'm not good enough. I can't get there. And examine that. I mean, step one is you've always got to go in first. And you've got to examine what are those things that I'm telling myself and holding myself back. I'm not the ideal entrepreneur, or I have to do everything myself because it's the only way that I can get it done well. I have to do 110% because I can't find anybody else. These are all voices that we tell ourselves, and women entrepreneurs do this very, very well because this is what we're told to do. So that's step one. Identify those naysayer voices, step back, ask what is the underlying assumption, and then reframe that underlying assumption. I actually don't have to do it all myself. I can get other people to help me, and I will get more done as a result. Step two is they've got to recognize some of these assumptions that are out there with the funders that they're looking for. So for example, I mean, the lack of funding for women's businesses by VCs is extremely well documented. And those biases still exist. Women can't scale. Women don't work hard enough, which I find absolutely hilarious. Women aren't operational enough, or they're not strategic enough. Take your pick. And then when you look at the research behind it, it's all bunk. None of it's accurate. None of it holds up under research. So we have to be able to come up with ways of naming, or at least seeing those assumptions coming from those funders when they are looking for us. We can't do anything about that filter, that pre-filter. We can't do much about that. But once we're in the door, we can start to play with that. That pre-filter piece, we have to work with other organizations, so entrepreneur networks that can help us open that door. The Babson Entrepreneur Network, which is phenomenal, and all these different alliances that are now more and more aware of getting women funders. I think it's a really important resource to help deal with some of this embedded bias that's there. The next thing I'll say is that as you scale, it's the easiest thing to do is to build inclusion as you go. It is a heck of a lot easier to be 500, a heck of a lot harder to be 500 people, and now you want to do inclusion. But if you're at 5 people or 10 people and you start to build these inclusive processes about hiring, about performance evaluation, all these little things that we build our business around, and we build it at the beginning, then when we scale, it's already there. We don't have to make a change. And inclusion will just happen because we built those mechanisms from day one. So much easier. So much easier.
That's great. Okay, so tell people where they can find your book, all that good stuff, how they get in touch with you.
So the best thing to do to find the book is to go on Amazon, The Next Smart Step. If you can't find it, The Next Smart Step, Detjen, Detjen, it'll pop right back up. We have an ebook out. The ebook's out already. The hard copy comes out Feb 9, so you can pre-order it. If you want to get a hold of me, Jodi, Jodi, at orangegroveconsulting.com. Jodi at orangegroveconsulting.com.
All right. Thanks for joining us today, Jodi. And
Thanks,
we
Bobby.
will talk to you all soon.
Thanks, everybody.